Hello again. Because the history of black Africans and their descendants is somewhat, shall we say, lacking in achievements, it is only natural that those touting this sort of history should turn to white history and see what they can pinch and claim credit for. We see this when people like President Biden tell audiences that a black man invented the electric light bulb, and other even more bizarre suggestions that we see cropping up, such as that it was a black man who first set up a blood bank, invented automatic doors for lifts, that sort of thing. Most ordinary people see such alternative history for what it is, a fantasy dreamed up to allow black people to pretend that their ancestors actually played an important role in the development of Western civilization. Hardly anybody takes these things seriously, but it doesn't really do any harm. If people want to play at make-believe, it doesn't affect reality. However, a group of people decided to be a little more bold in their assertions, and rather than dream up stuff about black people inventing the aeroplane or being the first to split the atom and so on, they decided to try and persuade people in the United States that the nation owed its very existence as a democratic country to black people. How on earth could they tell such a barefaced lie, you ask? Let's look at this scam and see how it was worked. The 1619 project, and I give a link to the Wikipedia page about this in the description to this video, was so called because that was supposedly the year when black African slaves were first imported to the American colonies. That's why the project was launched in 2019, to mark the 300th anniversary of this event. It was devised by a black woman called Nicole Hannah Jones, who worked for the New York Times. And the avowed aim of the 1619 project is that it should, and I quote, aim to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of black Americans at the very centre of the United States national narrative. This sounds eerily similar to what is being done in Britain currently, when colonialism, imperialism and the slave trade are being placed at the centre of British history, and everything like the Industrial Revolution is seen as a consequence of those things. In this way, the suffering of black people becomes central to British history, and it is impossible to understand, say, the 19th century without thinking about slavery and capitalism. The central conceit of the 1619 project is that the very existence of the United States was a direct consequence of slavery. It is claimed that the Revolutionary War was fought and the Declaration of Independence signed primarily because there was a fear in the American colonies that Britain might abolish slavery. This is of course completely nuts, as any historian will point out. There was no abolitionist movement in Britain when the American Revolutionary War began in 1775. More to the point, one of the first things to happen when the United States had wrenched itself free of Britain was that every state north of Maryland at once chose to abolish slavery anyway. The idea that the whole thing was caused by a desire to retain slavery simply doesn't hold water. When the New York Times brought out a special edition devoted to this nonsense, a number of historians pointed out the flaws in the ideas which were advanced. But they were fighting against a powerful ideology which was stronger than either common sense or historical accuracy. It sounded such a good idea to put black people at the very centre of American history, and it was not hard to paint anybody opposed to this scheme as a dyed-in-the-wool reactionary conservative and very likely a racist into the bargain. Many of those who could see how crazy the idea was felt it better to keep their mouths shut and simply ignore the whole thing. This has had the unfortunate effect of letting the vague idea grow, especially among black people, that the very establishment of the United States and its existence as an independent nation is inextricably bound up with slavery. Truly, this places black people at the heart of American history. As I say, left-wing types in Britain are now trying to get something similar off the ground in this country as well, and they're doing very well at it so far. Efforts to make black people at the heart of British history are progressing well, and just as in America, nobody really likes to point out that the ideas being floated are barking mad and completely divorced from reality. The lobby putting all this forward relies on the fact that nobody wants to be accused of laughing at black people or even pointing out politely when they're talking nonsense. Just see how much mileage people like David Olusoga have got from this reluctance to speak out about such matters. If viewers wonder why Britain's history is being airbrushed out of existence and replaced with a very strange version which they don't recognise, this is the reason. Just as we copy America in other cultural ways, such as in pop music and fast food, so too a version of the 1619 project has come into being on this side of the Atlantic, and in the last few years has been gaining a very firm foothold.